We made it to part 4. Aren't you proud of yourself? What an accomplishment. All right, let's look into some of the other impacts of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution strengthened the idea of laissez-faire, the idea that government should refrain from interfering in economic affairs, but it also strengthened the idea of socialism, which helped spark workers' protests. The most celebrated supporter of laissez-faire was Adam Smith, a Scottish economist. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that if individuals were allowed to seek personal gain, the effect, as though guided by an invisible hand, would be to increase the general welfare. The government should refrain from interfering in business, except to protect private property. Furthermore, it should allow duty-free trade with other countries. Industrialization was not improving the general welfare if you were looking at this from a factory worker's point of view, but it was causing great misery for some segments of society. Now, some thinkers blamed the workers' plight on the population boom, which outstripped the food supply and led to falling wages. The workers' poverty, they claimed, was as much a result of natural law as was the wealth of successful businessmen, and the only way for the working class to avoid mass famine was to delay marriage and practice self-restraint and abstinence. Laissez-faire provided an ideological justification for a special kind of capitalism. Banks, stock markets, and chartered companies allowed investors to obtain profits with reasonable risks, but with much less government control and interference than in the past. But not everyone accepted the grim conclusions of the economists. Jeremy Bentham believed it was possible to maximize, quote, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, end quote, if only a parliament of enlightened reformers would study the social problems of the day and pass appropriate legislation. His philosophy became known as utilitarianism. And quick timeout, Google Jeremy Bentham, that's Bentham, and he had himself stuffed. This is the most, man, it's so weird. Jeremy Bentham had himself stuffed and placed in this closet, this cabinet, so that he could always be present at the faculty meetings or department meetings at his college. His head was stolen once upon a time. He's mostly not there. Let's be honest. He's not there. But yeah, that's a fun little Google rabbit hole or Wikipedia rabbit hole. Jeremy Bentham right there. All right. Some French social thinkers, moved by more sincere concern for the poor, offered a more radically new vision of a just civilization. Espousing a philosophy called positivism, the Count of Saint-Simon argued that the scientific method could solve social as well as technical problems. He argued that the poor, guided by scientists and artists, should form workers' communities under the protection of benevolent business leaders. Instead of attracting workers, however, those ideas found enthusiastic support from bankers and entrepreneurs who were inspired by them to invest in railroads, canals, and other symbols of modernity. Positivism also influenced the political elites of Brazil and Mexico, who pursued a top-down program of economic development reinforced by harsh police controls and the manipulation of political institutions. Numerous protest organizations formed across Europe, the most prominent of which, calling themselves communists, were led by two German-born intellectuals, Karl Marx, who's pictured on the slide, and his longtime collaborator and benefactor, the guy from Part 1, Friedrich Engels. They argued that the concentration of wealth and power associated with industrialization had led to the unbearable oppression of the industrial workers, the proletariat. They argued that history was dominated by class struggle, and the proletariat would inevitably come together to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the modern class that controlled industry. The final words of their book, The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, urged revolutionary activity with the challenge, "Proletarians of all countries, unite!" Workers benefited little from the ideas of those middle-class philosophers. Instead, they resisted harsh conditions in their own ways. They changed jobs frequently and were often absent, especially on Mondays. I'm not sure how we know that. Periodically, workers rioted, went on strike, or violently resisted the introduction of new technologies, believing that mechanized production would diminish the value of their skills and force them into poverty. As early as 1767, disgruntled textile workers destroyed the machines driven by water power in Blackburn, England, and in 1811, angry lace and stocking workers, calling themselves Luddites, attacked more than 100 businesses and destroyed nearly every machine in the district. In the late 1770s, French workers organized protests against foreign innovations, attacking British craftsmen and destroying new machines. In the early stages of the French Revolution, popular revolutionary sentiment reinforced the resistance of workers to new machinery and undermined the ability of the government to protect factories. The result was that French artisans retained traditional control of production, and France fell decades behind Britain in industrializing. When wealthy farmers began to introduce reapers and other machines, the rural poor set fires, threatened landlords, demanded higher wages, and broke the machines. This popular movement culminated after 1830, when widespread rural riots say that 3 times fast. This popular movement culminated after 1830, when widespread rural riots forced the British government to mobilize troops and militia in defense of property. In the end, thousands of protesters were arrested and either imprisoned in Britain or transported to Australia as convict laborers. Also, if you got Disney Plus, watch the episode of The Simpsons where they go to Australia. I think it's called Bart versus Australia, probably around like season 4, season 5. It is one of the best episodes of television in the history of television. These violent efforts to block innovation and protect long-established customs in manufacturing and agriculture were superseded by laboring class organizations focused on workplace reform, higher wages, and expanded political rights. Gradually, workers formed benevolent societies and organized to demand universal male suffrage and shorter workdays. In 1834, Robert Owen founded the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union to lobby for an 8-hour workday. It quickly gained 500,000 members, but collapsed a few months later. Why did it collapse? Because of government prosecution of trade union activities. So basically, laissez-faire was only in the interest of keeping government out of business affairs, except when they needed the government to stop the proletariat from fighting for better wages. The Chartist movement had more success, gathering petitions by the thousands to present to Parliament. Although Chartism collapsed in 1848, it still left a legacy of labor organizing. Eventually, mass movements persuaded the British Parliament to investigate conditions in factories and mines and initiate some reforms. The Factory Act of 1833 prohibited the employment of children younger than 9 in the textile mills and limited the working hours of children between the ages of 9 and 13 to 8 hours a day. And hey, if you're 14 to 18, you could only work 12 hours a day. Only 12. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited the employment of women and boys under the age of 10. On the European continent, in contrast, the revolutions of 1848 revealed widespread discontent with repressive governments, but failed to soften the hardships of industrialization. The spread of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century transformed the relations of Western Europe and North America with the rest of the world. In Egypt and India, cheap industrial imports, backed by the power of Great Britain, delayed industrialization for a century or more, and China was defeated by the products of industrial manufacture. In these cases, we can discern the outlines of Western domination that has characterized the history of the world since the late 19th century. Let's take a look at Egypt. Egypt was strongly influenced by European ideas since the French invasion of 1798, which we'll kind of get to talk about, began to industrialize in the early 19th century. The driving force was its ruler, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, and I'm going to say that every time I talk about Muhammad Ali of Egypt. He was a man who played a major role in the history of the Middle East and East Africa. At this point, Egypt is still under the Ottoman Empire, and he's going to try to kind of distance them from the Ottoman Empire. So, wanting to build up the Egyptian economy and military in order to become less dependent on the Ottoman Sultan, Muhammad Ali imported advisors and technicians from Europe and built cotton mills, foundries, shipyards, weapons factories, and other industrial enterprises. To pay for all this, he made the peasants grow wheat and cotton, which the government bought at a low price and exported at a profit. He also imposed high tariffs on imported goods to force the pace of industrialization. Muhammad Ali's efforts fell afoul of the British, who did not want a powerful country threatening to interrupt the flow of travelers and mail across Egypt, the shortest route between England and India. When Egypt went to war against the Ottoman Empire in 1839, Britain intervened and forced Muhammad Ali to eliminate all import duties in the name of free trade. Unprotected, Egypt's fledgling industries could not compete with the flood of cheap British products. Thereafter, Egypt exported raw cotton, imported manufactured goods, and became an economic dependency of Britain. And this is the way that colonization works, making a colony dependent on the colonizing country. Until the late 18th century, India had been the world's largest producer and exporter of cotton textiles, handmade by skilled spinners and weavers. The British East India Company took over large parts of India just as the Industrial Revolution was beginning in Britain. It allowed cheap British factory-made yarn and cloth to flood the Indian market duty-free, putting spinners and handloom weavers out of work. Unlike in Britain, India had no factories where displaced handicraft workers could go. Most of them became landless peasants, eking out a precarious living. Like other tropical regions, India became an exporter of raw materials and an importer of British industrial goods. To hasten the process, British entrepreneurs and colonial officials introduced railroads into the subcontinent. The construction of India's first railroad network began in the mid-1850s, along with coal mining to fuel the locomotives and the installation of telegraph lines to connect major cities. Some Indian entrepreneurs saw opportunities in the atmosphere of change that the British created. In 1854, a Bombay merchant, an engineer, and 4 unskilled workers started India's first textile mill. This was the beginning of India's mechanized cotton industry. Despite many gifted entrepreneurs, however, India's industrialization proceeded at a snail's pace, for the government was in British hands and the British did nothing to encourage Indian industry. Now moving on to China. Having benefited from a long period of relative political stability, population growth, and commercial expansion, the Qing dynasty saw little reason to focus on foreign trade or to promote the new machine technologies that had rapidly transformed the European economy in the 19th century. China continued to play a major role in the markets of Asia, even as European power grew, maintaining a favorable balance of trade that Europe paid for in silver. Moreover, China remained an agrarian empire, with a conservative elite and a growing peasant population. As such, China focused on the production and distribution of food rather than on trade as an effective guarantee of social peace. This situation was about to change. In January 1840, a ship launched from Britain. It was a radically new ship whose iron hull and flat bottom allowed it to navigate in shallow waters, and it had a steam engine to power it upriver and against the wind. In November, the ship, the Nemesis, arrived off the coast of China, heavily armed and ready to reverse the steep trade imbalance long enjoyed by China. Though ships from Europe had been sailing to China for 300 years, the Nemesis was the first steam-powered iron gunboat in Asian waters. It was soon joined by other steam-powered warships that collectively established European control of Chinese rivers, bombarding forts and cities and transporting troops and supplies from place to place along the coast and up the rivers far more quickly than Chinese soldiers could move on foot. With this new weapon, Britain, a small island nation half a world away, compelled China to recognize the economic and military transformation wrought by industrial innovation in Europe and defeated the largest and most populated country in the world. Now that's just a sampling of some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. There's tons more. I would encourage you to look into other effects on other countries and to probe in a little bit more deeply into the effects on China and India and Egypt. India and Egypt are going to become especially important as we get into talking about colonization and things like that, and decolonization later. And definitely about talking about the Middle East, if we can even make it that far in our class. So I hope we can. I have faith. We can do this. Again, if you have any questions, always feel free to email me. I have virtual office hours on Zoom, posting the link to the Blackboard page. And we will have a quiz, so be sure to tune in to the Blackboard page to find the quiz. Again, it's multiple choice. It's just 5 questions. If you've listened to the lectures, you've halfway paid attention, it shouldn't be too difficult. All right, guys. Have a great day. Stay inside, but get some fresh air every now once in a while, but socially distance. In fact, I'm 6 feet away from my computer right now. Not really. All right, guys. Have a good one.